They here with Phil Colvin. He's telling a story about the werewolf he's seen at Wolf Creek Pass. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And Philip, it's been a pleasure meeting you. Pleasure chatting with you the last couple of days. Won't you tell us your story?
Well, in 2011, I saw something that I thought I would never see on anywhere but a movie. It was a straight up werewolf, and I saw it from less than 15 feet away for an extended amount of time. A little bit about me. I'm 51 years old. I grew up in the woods. I make rustic and log furniture, so I'm always in the woods gathering wood or camping or mountain biking, dirt biking, hunting, whatever. And I've been in the military. I grew up on military bases. And up to that point, I thought I had seen every single thing there was to see in the woods. I mean, I've even seen Bigfoot way off in the distance and even came across its tracks after I went and tried to hunt it down. And even that creature wasn't even close to the size of the werewolf, dogman, skinwalker, whatever you want to call it, that I saw that night. Um, I didn't even have any idea that anything like that would even exist. I've never heard of the dogman up until just a few years ago. I was doing some research on it. And basically what happened is my wife and I were going to a wedding that was down in Pagosa Springs, and we had to come from Fort Collins, and we were waiting for our friend who was going to go in her mini. We were going to go in her minivan. Uh, I never drink. I've never had a cup of coffee. Don't smoke. Never had a cigarette in my life. So I'm always the designated driver, and so I drove, and it takes quite a while to get from Fort Collins to Pagosa Springs. Uh, like I said, it's in southern Colorado. I'm in northern Colorado. And at the time, my son, River Danger, was 2 years old. And he was coming along with us. He was in his car seat. And mom and her best friend they're very fond of margaritas, both of them. They're derby girls at the time. They were doing a roller derby. And they're very fond of margaritas. And since they had a designated driver and they're on their way to what was going to be a late night, early morning bachelor party before the wedding, uh, they did their pre-party prep the whole time, all the way down there drinking margaritas. So they passed out kind of early, long before I got to Wolf Creek Pass or anywhere near the Continental Divide. So everything was really quiet at that point, which is a rare thing for me to enjoy as a father, especially back then with the 2 year old. And I just basically was driving in complete silence. And one of my favorite places to pull off is the Wolf Creek Pass overlook. And as soon as you get over the Continental Divide, it overlooks the valley. And this was in July. It was a full moon night. Probably, I don't know if it's because of the event that happened that night, but in my mind, it was easily the brightest full moon evening I've ever experienced in my whole life. I've never seen one that bright before and never seen one that bright after. And I mean, it was lighting up everything almost like day because it was 11:30 or so at night by the time I pulled off there. And I got out, I was stretching, and I don't know what it was. My spidey sense, that sixth sense that tells you there's danger. Maybe it was the smell of blood because there was a elk that had been ripped in half. I didn't see it at night. That night, I didn't see it. I saw it the next day when I came back. And so the hind end was on the side where I was on the overlook, and the top quarter or the top half was up on the other side, and it was a massive elk. And it had just been ripped in half. There's a big blood spot in the middle of the road when I came back, and you could see the splatter going from each side. It looks like something just grabbed it, ripped it in half, and threw half of each of it to the side. And I don't know if I came up on its dinner or that was left as a warning or anything like that, but something. And I'm not sure if it, like I said, the smell of blood or whatever, just my danger sense went off. So I jumped back in the car and I looked around. I rolled down the window. I didn't really see anything, but I heard a rustling off on the other side. And there's lots of wild animals up there. I've seen all kinds of animals, lots of moose, elk, deer. I've seen wolves up there. And the name Wolf Creek Pass was passed down from a French trapper, is what I read later on down the line. And the reason he named it that was because he had seen wolf-like creatures, not wolves. It specifically says wolf-like creatures, and I always found that really interesting after the fact, given what I had seen. Um, these kind of things, the werewolves and things like that, they sit in the back of your mind in like that realm of fantasy. I've heard other people talking about similar creatures, like in Afghanistan. A lot of my colleagues spoke about seeing a jackal man, like a wolf, werewolf, jackal type thing that they shot at and nothing happened. And, I just laughed that off and was like, yeah, there's nothing like that exists except in movies. Anyway, I'm sitting there looking around and I hear the rustling, but it doesn't really raise any alarms or anything like that. So I just put it in drive, still with this uneasy feeling, and I turn off onto the road. And this road, it's a 2-lane highway, and there was even construction going on at the time, so it was very narrow because there was some barriers on the side. And on one side, it's a sheer cliff that goes straight up. Then there's the road, and then there's a sheer cliff going straight down on the other side, and it goes down for about 1,000 feet. So if you get on this road, there's really nowhere you can go to hide or anything like that. There's no brush on the side of the road or anything like that. There's a couple of little pull offs, and that's it. And there's probably about, I don't know, a 3 or 4 foot little section on the side of the road that's kind of gravel and rock, that you can kind of see that goes all the way down the road. And it goes down and it makes a U-turn around a bend. And in between that U-turn, the Wolf Creek flows right underneath the highway and then goes straight down into the valley. So in between me and around the corner, the water is there. And so there's nowhere, literally nowhere anything can go if it's out on the road. So I start driving, and off in the distance, probably about 200 yards away, I see a large black figure ambling down the side of the road. And it's on all fours, and it's clearly black. It's dark. I can see it, but I didn't really get an idea of the actual size of this thing at that point because it was a little further away, and your perception isn't as good. So I just kept driving, and I drove real slow because I wanted to see it. To myself, I thought it was a black bear, which is not super uncommon, but you don't see a black bear running down the road very often. And I noticed the way that it was running, its gait was a little bit off. It didn't run like a bear. It it just looked like it was possibly injured, is what I initially thought. As I got closer, I kept seeing eye shine out of my light as it kept like looking behind it, and it saw me coming, kept looking behind, and the eye shine was red, like glowing red. And as I got a little closer, I was pretty sure that it was a bear, but then I started noticing the size of this thing was much larger than any bear I've ever seen before. And I've seen black bear, I've seen grizzly, I've been in the wilderness up in Alaska, I've seen Kodiak, I've seen polar bears at the zoo. I've seen a really large polar bear at the zoo. We have a really big polar bear at the Denver Zoo here. and he's way bigger than any grizzly or Kodiak I've ever seen. And this creature was black, and it was way bigger than any of those things. I thought it might have been like, my mind was racing. I didn't know what to think at this point because I was going really slow and I was about ready to pull up right next to it. And at this point, I got to see its tail. And its tail was a long tail, a cane, obviously like a canine tail, very bushy. And I also saw, you have to forgive me here, its testicles uh, swinging in the wind in the back there as it was running. So I knew it was a male. And at that point, I pulled up next to it, and the light was still pretty good. I mean, the moon was right up above us, shining straight down. And I looked at it, and I noticed that its fur was longer than what I was used to seeing on a bear. And it also looked very supple and had this kind of iridescence in the moonlight that was really strange, like almost crystalline in nature. It was no other word for it. It was really beautiful, and the hair, the soft, it looked soft, not coarse like a grizzly or a brown bear's hair. You know how it's kind of spiky looking. You can tell the difference between coarse hair and long hair that kind of lays down. And I mean, it literally looked like a Vidal Sassoon commercial running down the road. Its hair was just flowing in the wind and everything. And as I pulled up directly next to it, it pulled off into a little pull off that was on the side. There was a sign, a mile marker sign that says Pagosa Springs, like 20 miles or something like that. And it was looking at me, and it was still on all fours at this point. And I looked at it, and we locked eyes. And the look in its eyes was so human and calculating that it was just really unnatural. And that's when I noticed that it had these tufted ears that till then had been tucked back, but it raised up, and they're huge. They even look comically huge on this creature, which was just massive. And I'm looking at it, and it has tufts on the end. And I'm really telling my age here, but if you've ever seen the movie The Howling, the original like werewolf movie, with it looked just like that in the face. I noticed I've seen a lot of wolves. There's a wolf sanctuary right down the street, and my roommate used to have a wolf dog, so I've seen a lot of wolves. And I looked at this thing's face, and it had the head of a wolf, but it looked like it was kind of curled on itself, kind of like a dog with its tails between its legs. You know how the butt tucks underneath? And I don't know. I just got the feeling that it was trying to disguise itself some way, or I don't know, just make me move past it. And, at that point, I could have, if it would have done anything else than what it did next, I could have went by that and been like, well, that was the largest wolf I've ever seen. And, never thought of it again. But at that point, when we were locking eyes, I could see in its eyes that it made some kind of decision, and I think its decision was that it was going to show itself to me, or scare me off, or do I don't know what its motivations were, but what it did next was it kind of hunched up on its back legs, arms down, and at that point I still thought they were like legs and paws, and it looked at me, turned its head kind of sideways, and then it stood up on two legs. And as it was standing up, I heard the most sickening sound of, like, I don't know, it sounded like a mixture of joints popping and bones cracking. It was a disgusting sound. It's if you've ever heard somebody break a bone, it was pretty much like that, only really, really loud. and it stood up and it just kept going up and up and up, and it was next to this sign, which the next day after the wedding was over, on the way back, I stopped and measured it because I keep a measuring tape with me pretty much at all times in my toolbox. And that sign was 9 feet tall. And this thing, when it was fully standing up, could have literally stuck its arm like on the top of the sign and just rested it there. It was easily over 10 feet tall. And I have never, other than an elephant at the zoo, seen any animal that was that size. And it was fully covered from head to toe in black, like midnight black hair, except for on the top of the chest and on the abs, on the stomach, and on the bottom of the hands. And I know that because it when it stood all the way up, it kind of put its hands out to its side. Like if you ever seen like a drunk man, threatening, try about ready to get into a fight, like throw his arms out to the side. It looks exactly that was the exact kind of mannerism that I got from that whole interaction with him. And I've seen in nature where animals, when they try to intimidate, they make themselves bigger, which is ridiculous considering this thing was over 10 feet tall. But it was very effective. I was definitely scared to the spot. I've never been to the point. I mean, I've seen things that most people would just die of fright from in my lifetime. And I've never been scared to the point where I was immobilized. And I could not take my eyes away from its eyes. And it was just looking at me. You could tell it was calculating. It was so human like in its uh, eyes, in the eye expressions, and the way that it looked. When you see like a mountain lion looking at you in a predatory way, it doesn't look like it's thinking, calculating like that. This looked like it was really sizing up the situation. It knew that it had been seen. It had no choice but to confront me because I had stopped at the side of the road at this point and we were just looking at each other. Uh, all my wife and kid and my wife's friend were just passed out of sleep. They didn't get to see any of this. And in the full moonlight, I saw was a 10-foot werewolf. I mean, there's no other explanation for it. And I realized that my experience of watching movies may have colored my perception of this situation, but I'm pretty realistic and detail oriented kind of guy. I love to learn new things, and I don't find things on the internet with instant access. I like to search for things, and this was definitely something that piqued my curiosity even though I was scared to death. It At that point it like opened up its hands and I could see that its claws, its fingers, each finger was over a foot long, and the palms of its hands were, it looked just like human hands except the palms were extended a little bit longer, and then the fingers, and each finger was a foot long, and each claw was easily over 6 inches at the end of its fingers, and they were razor sharp. They looked like, they almost looked crystalline as well because they were kind of see-through and they kind of shimmered in the light of the moon. And then it started growling, and I couldn't audibly barely hear it growling, but in your chest, I could feel the rumbling in my chest. I could feel the rumbling in the steering wheel. It was such a low frequency growl, and it was looking straight down at me. I was looking straight up at it, and there's no question. There's nothing that I've ever seen in the woods that would even come close to explaining what I was looking at. And I was just drowning in disbelief. My mind was racing. I didn't know I didn't know what I was looking at. I didn't know if I was hallucinating somehow. I just was in complete shock. And this all came out verbally, and I audibly said out loud, "Is that a effing werewolf?" And it looked me straight in the eye, and it nodded its head as if to say, "Yes, I'm a freaking werewolf." And I was at that point I knew that it was thinking on the level of like a human, and it understood me. It knew what I had said to it. Its ears were swiveling. The ears were so big, there's no way it could have not heard me speak. I mean, that thing could have heard everything for miles around, guaranteed. And I think actually that's one of the things that saved me that night was its hearing was so acute. And so I'm just looking at this thing and I'm just sizing it up, looking at it, taking in every detail because it wasn't moving towards me. It wasn't making any threatening gestures other than, making itself real big and throwing its arms out, showing me its claws and stuff. At this point, its mouth kind of opened up and I could hear it breathing, and the wind kind of kicked up, and the smell of it like hit me like a freight truck. It smelled like a mix between a long dead and decaying animal and a wet dog, like the worst combination you could ever imagine. And it was putrid, just putrid smelling, and the look in its eyes was just pure evil intent, not predatory. I mean, I've seen the same real similar look. I've had the unfortunate experience of looking into the eyes of a murderer, somebody who'd killed multiple people. And that look and the look of the murderer were eerily similar. That 10,000 yard stare of somebody that's just completely insane. And I mean, I had a 357 in the door right next to me. And I had no doubt in my mind that if I had pulled that and shot that thing, it wouldn't have done nothing at all to it. And I don't know, just the realization of where this thing sat on the food chain and where I sat on the food chain was such a large difference. I had thought that, I was pretty confident that humans and that me in general among humans was pretty much in the apex predator territory. I'm well trained. I've trained in weapons, I've trained in martial arts, and I had no illusions what would have happened if I would have been outside of my car at that point in time. That thing would have took me and made me into Swiss cheese in like 2 seconds. There's nothing that I could have done to protect my family. If I had the gun pointed, I think it would have ate the gun. It was just literally the most terrifying thing that I could even possibly imagine. There was nothing that I've ever seen that was even close to as deadly as this thing was. Every ounce of its being was just obviously geared towards killing something. Its muscles were massive, like corded. Can you shut that? Its muscles were massive, just corded, and it was very skinny, but it's kind of weird. It was huge, but it was also kind of skinny. Its top of its torso, the chest was very barrel like. It was just massive, but then it went kind of down into a V where its waist was really skinny, and then the haunches on it, the back of it, like his buttocks and everything, were just big. Like you could tell that they were really strong. You could tell that it was built over years and years of running, and it had like a tuft of fur around its mid underneath its belly button down to probably about middle of its thighs, and around its neck. I call it a mane because it kind of looked like a mane, a real bushy mane. And the rest of it was kind of short haired, but it was all covered. The whole body was covered with hair, the arms, except for the palms and the chest and stomach. Everything was black. The skin on the chest and stomach was black. The skin on the bottom of the hands was black. Kind of reminded me of like a gorilla. The hand, like if you looked at a gorilla's hand, it was that color with massive claws. The teeth on it, although the head was canine, the teeth did not look canine. For some reason, to me, they just struck me as much more reptilian looking because the front fangs reminded me of like a rattlesnake. They were really, really long, probably 8 inches longer than the claws, quite a bit longer than the claws. And they were hanging out of the side of the mouth before it had opened its mouth. But with its mouth open, you could tell that the teeth were really set in like a dog's teeth, but each tooth wasn't like a dog's tooth. They were really skinny and needle-like. Even the small ones in the back, and they were all curved backwards. That's how close I was to this thing, and those teeth kind of had the same kind of shimmering look as the claws and the fur did in the moonlight, and they kind of looked like they were brittle to the point because they were so thin and sharp. But I just absolutely couldn't believe what I was looking at. And at this point, I finally got enough, I don't know, courage, or my muscles started working enough again for me. I reached down to grab my phone, which was right next to me, because I was going to take a picture of this thing because it wasn't moving. And at this point, I'd been looking at it for probably a good 45 seconds to a minute, and it hadn't moved. It was just staring at me in the eyes. And the second that I broke eye contact and looked down at my phone, it stepped out onto the roadway. And that's when I noped out. There was my full my full mobility was restored at that point by fear, and I just stomped on the gas so hard that I felt like I was going to push that thing through the floor. And my wheel, or my friend's minivan, it doesn't have a whole lot of pick me up, but we were facing downhill, so it was a pretty steep grade. So we picked up speed pretty quick, but my tires were squealing, and I think that kind of interrupted its charge because it kind of surprised it or hurt its ears because it like reared back a little bit, like didn't like it, definitely didn't like that sound. But it was running next to me like sideways on two legs. If you've ever seen like the a football player doing their training where they do the run sideways and then turn, it was kind of doing that. But it kept up with me doing that until I hit about 30 miles an hour. And at that point, it was running step, and then the next instant it was running on four legs. It just went straight down, and it wasn't running like it was running before. The body was fully extended, and it was kind of like a horse, but it was full stride. It was running, and it hadn't come closer to me than the side of the road, but it was starting to come in, like trying to cut me off a little bit. And right then, luckily, the van shifted into a higher gear and I started going faster. And about the time that I hit 50 miles an hour, it started to drop back a little bit. By the time I hit 55, it had pulled behind the vehicle, and I was still looking at it in my rearview mirror. And it stopped, it stood up, and I want to say howl, but it wasn't really a howl. It was more of it sounded like a human screaming and a bear roaring at the same time. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term infrasound, but there are some animals that use this infrasound to paralyze creatures while they're hunting. And I think that was kind of what it was trying to do, but it was way too late. I had already hit like 65 and I was about ready to come around the corner. And at that point, the slope on the downside of the road was probably only about 40 feet till to the valley floor, and then across there was the stream, and then around the corner was where the road went around and came back around the corner on the other side. And looking in the rearview mirror, I saw it jump over the side of the road, over the safety barrier, and down into the valley. And what I think it was doing was trying to cut across the center, go over the creek, and meet me on the other side. I mean, I was flying at this point. I was probably going about 80 miles an hour, just still tires screeching. Nobody woke up because they were happily sleeping, drunk sleeping in the back. And my son was always a heavy sleeper. And I'm just panicking. And I literally drifted around this corner the whole way, like in some kind of racing movie or something. And as I came around the other side, I drove past where its line of going across would have been. And as I went over the top of the hill, you come around a corner and it goes down to the left, and it goes down to another drop that goes down into the Pagosa Springs. And as I looked up in the rearview mirror, I saw it pop up over the other side, stand in the middle of the road, and just let out another howl. And it was standing there just, and it was so loud that even though I was good, probably 300-400 yards away from it at that point, as I was speeding down the road and about ready to go around the corner, I could clearly hear it and still feel it in my chest. It still rattled everything in the car with how forceful it was. It was hair raising. Literally to this day, when I think about the sound that it made, I break out in a cold sweat and I get goosebumps on my arm just thinking about it. And that's the last I saw of it. I drove on down to Pagosa Springs and we went down to the farm where this wedding was taking place, and we were supposed to be camping outside that night. And so I set up the tents and everything, and I was real quiet. And like I said, I never drink or anything like that. But that night I did drink quite a bit, and everybody that knew me kind of realized that something was up. And I couldn't bring myself to tell anybody, not even my wife, at what I had seen that night, because it's like my mind was processing it the whole time, and I was just in complete shock. And I was really fearful that this thing could have hunted me down, by scent, or followed the road, or found us, because it's not too far off to think that something like that could easily track you. And I mean, it ran almost 50 miles an hour, pretty close to 55. So, I mean, it wouldn't take it very long to travel that extra 20 miles to get to where I was at. That's for sure. And the whole way is forested all the way up into town there. So it would have had plenty of opportunities to cut across the mountains, and with the thing's abilities that it had and its size. I mean, all night long, I just kept looking out into the darkness, waiting to see this thing show up again. Thankfully, it never did, and I've never seen anything before like that, or never seen anything like it again. But for probably like a year, there was just every time I went into the woods or the forest, I was very apprehensive. And even with my carrying my gun, it didn't feel very comforting at all to have that weapon at my side out in the forest for a whole year. But I think
So,
reason eventually got the best of me, and I decided that it was such a rare thing that I've only seen one of these things. Chances are I'll never see one again. Fingers crossed.
hey, this meeting is about to end right here, and I'm going to let you reload it. So we'll stop right there, and then as soon as I can get it reloaded, we'll take back off. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, and I really appreciate your time. I really do.